Next, said I, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience as this. Picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cavern with a long entrance open to the light on its entire width. Conceive them as having their legs and necks fettered from childhood so that they remain in the same spot, able to look forward only, and prevented by the fetters from turning their heads. Picture further the light from a fire burning higher up and at a distance behind them, and between the fire and the prisoners, and above them a road along which a low wall has been built, as the exhibitors of puppet shows have partitions before the men themselves, above which they show the puppets. See also then men carrying past the wall implements of all kinds that rise above the wall, and human images and shapes of animals as well, wrought in stone and wood, in every material. Some of these bearers presumably speaking, and others silent. For, to begin with, tell me, do you think that these men would have seen anything of themselves or of one another except the shadows cast from the fire on the wall of the cave that fronted them? And again, would not the same be true of the objects carried past them? If then they were able to talk to one another, do you not think that they would suppose that in naming the things that they saw, they were naming the passing objects? And if their prison had an echo from the wall opposite them, when one of the passerby uttered a sound, do you think that they would suppose anything else than the passing shadow to be the speaker? Then in every way such prisoners would deem reality to be nothing else than the shadows of the artificial objects. Now consider then what would be the manner of the release and healing from these bonds and this folly if in the course of nature something of this sort should happen to them. When one was freed from his fetters and compelled to stand up suddenly and turn his head around and walk up and to lift up his eyes to the light, and in doing all of this felt pain, and because of the dazzle and the glitter of the light was unable to discern the objects whose shadows he formerly saw, what do you suppose would be his answer if someone told him that what he had seen before was all a cheat and an illusion? But that now, being nearer to reality and turned toward more real things, he saw more truly. And if also one should point out to him each of the passing objects and constrain him by questions to say what it is, do you not think that he would be at a loss, and that he would regard what he formerly saw as more real than the things now pointed out to him? And if he were compelled to look at the light itself, would not that pain his eyes, and would he not turn away and flee to those things which he is able to discern and regard them as in every deed more clear and exact than the objects pointed out? And if someone should drag him thence by force up the ascent, which is rough and steep, and not let him go before he had drawn him out into the light of the sun, do you not think that he would find it painful to be so hauled along, and would chafe at it? And when he came out into the light, that his eyes would be filled with its beams, so that he would not be able to see even one of the things that we call real. Then there would be need of habituation, I take it, to enable him to see the things higher up. And at first, he would most easily discern the shadows, and after that, the likeliness or reflections in water of men and other things, and later, the things themselves. And from these, he would go on to contemplate the appearances in the heavens and heaven itself, more easily by night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, than by day the sun and the sun's light. So, finally, I suppose, he would be able to look upon the sun itself and see its true nature, not by reflections in water or phantasms of it in an alien setting, but in and by itself in its own place. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that this it is that provides the seasons and the courses of the year and presides over all things in the visible region, and is in some sort the cause of all these things that they had seen. Well then, if he recalled to mind his first habitation and what passed for wisdom there, and his fellow bondsmen, do you not think that he would count himself happy in the change and pity them? And if there had been honors and commendations among them, which they bestowed on one another, and prizes for the man who is quickest to make out the shadows as they pass and best able to remember their customary precedences, sequences, and coexistences, and so most successful in guessing at what was to come, do you think he would be very keen about such rewards, and that he would envy and emulate those who were honored by these prisoners and lorded it among them, or that he would feel with Homer and greatly prefer, while living on earth, to be serf of another, a landless man, and endure anything rather than opine with them and live that life? And consider this also, said I. If such a one should go down again and take his old place, would he not get his eyes full of darkness, thus suddenly coming out of the sunlight? Now, if he should be required to contend with these perpetual prisoners in evaluating these shadows while his vision was still dim and before his eyes were accustomed to the dark, and this time required for habituation would not be very short, would he not provoke laughter? And would it not be said of him that he had returned from his journey aloft with his eyes ruined, and that it was not worthwhile even to attempt the ascent? And if it were possible to lay hands on and to kill the man who tried to release them and lead them up, would they not kill him? This image, then, we must apply as a whole to all that has been said, likening the region revealed through sight to the habitation of the prison, and the light of the fire in it to the power of the sun. And if you assume that the ascent in the contemplation of the things above is the soul's ascension to the intelligible region, you will not miss my surmise, since that is what you desire to hear. But God knows whether it is true. But at any rate, my dream, as it appears to me, is that in the region of the known, the last thing to be seen and hardly seen is the idea of good. And that, when seen, it must needs point us to the conclusion that this is indeed the cause for all things, of all that is right and beautiful, giving birth to the visible world, to light, and the author of light and itself, in the intelligible world being the authentic source of truth and reason, and that anyone who is to act wisely in private or public must have caught sight of this. Come then, join me in this further thought, and do not be surprised that those who have attained to this height are not willing to occupy themselves with the affairs of men, but their souls ever feel the upward urge and the yearning for that sojourn above. For this, I take it, is likely if in this point too the likeness of our image holds. And again, do you think it all strange if a man, returning from divine contemplations to the petty miseries of men, cuts a sorry figure and appears most ridiculous, if, while still blinking through the gloom, and before he has become sufficiently accustomed to the environing darkness, he is compelled in courtrooms or elsewhere to contend about the shadows of justice or the images that cast the shadows, and to wrangle in debate about the notions of these things in the minds of those who have never seen justice itself. But a sensible man would remember that there are two distinct disturbances of the eyes arising from two causes, according as the shift is from light to darkness or from darkness to light, and believing that the same thing happens to the soul too. Whenever he saw a soul perturbed and unable to discern something, he would not laugh unthinkingly, but would observe whether coming from a brighter life its vision was obscured by the unfamiliar darkness, or whether the passage from the deeper dark of ignorance into a more luminous world and the greater brightness had dazzled its vision. And so he would deem the one happy in its experience and way of life, and pity the other. And if it pleased him to laugh at it, his laughter would be less laughable than that at the expense of the soul that had come down from the light above. Then, if this is true, our view of these matters must be this, that education is not in reality what some people proclaim it to be in their professions. What they aver is that they can put true knowledge into a soul that does not possess it, as if they were inserting vision into blind eyes. But our present argument indicates, said I, that the true analogy for this indwelling power in the soul and the instrument whereby each of us apprehends is that of an eye that could not be converted to the light from the darkness except by turning the whole body. Even so, this organ of knowledge must be turned around from the world of becoming together with the entire soul, like the scene shifting in the theater, until the soul is able to endure the contemplation of essence and the brightest region of being. And this, we say, is the good, do we not? Of this very thing, then, I said, there might be an art of the speediest and most effective shifting or conversation of the soul, not an art of producing vision in it, but on the assumption that it possesses vision, but does not rightly direct it, and does not look where it should, an art of bringing this about. Then the other so-called virtues of the soul do seem akin to those of the body, for it is true that where they do not pre-exist, they are afterward created by habit and practice. But the excellence of thought, it seems, is certainly of a more divine quality, a thing that never loses its potency, but, according to the direction of its conversion, becomes useful, beneficent, or, again, useless and harmful. Have you never observed in those who are popularly spoken of as bad but smart men how keen is the vision of the little soul, how quick it is to discern the things that interest it, a proof that it is not a poor vision, which it has, but one forcibly enlisted in the service of evil, so that the sharper its sight, the more mischief it accomplishes. Observe then, said I, that this part of such a soul, if it had been hammered from childhood and had thus been struck free of the leaden weights, so to speak, of our birth and becoming, which attaching themselves to it by food and similar pleasures and gluttonies turn downward the vision of the soul, if I say freed from these, it had suffered a conversion toward the things that are real and true. That same faculty of the same men would have been most keen in its vision of the higher things, just as it is for the things towards which it is now turned. Well then, said I, is not this also likely and a necessary consequence of what has been said, that neither could men who were uneducated and inexperienced in truth ever adequately preside over a state, nor could those who had been permitted to linger on to the end in the pursuit of culture, the one because they have no single aim and purpose in life to which all their actions, public and private, must be directed, and the others because they will not voluntarily engage in action, believing that while still living, they have been transported to the islands of the blessed. It is the duty of us, the founders, then, said I, to compel the best natures to attain the knowledge which we pronounced the greatest, and to win to the vision of the good, to scale that ascent, and when they have reached the heights and taken an adequate view, we must not allow what is now permitted. That they should linger there, I said, and refuse to go down again among those bondsmen and share their labors and honors, whether they are of less or greater worth. The law is not concerned with the special happiness of any class in the state, but it is trying to produce this condition in the city as a whole, harmonizing and adapting the citizens to one another by persuasion and compulsion, and requiring them to impart to one another any benefit which they are able to bestow upon the community, and that it itself creates such men in the state, not that it may allow each to take what course pleases them, but with a view of using them for the binding together of the commonwealth. We shall not be wronging either the philosophers who arise among us, but that we can justify our action when we constrain them to take charge of the other citizens and be their guardians. For we will say to them that it is natural that men of similar quality who spring up in other cities should not share in the labors there, for they grow up spontaneously from no volition of the government in the several states, and it is justice that the self-grown, indebted to none for its breeding, should not be zealous either to pay to anyone the price of its nurture. But you we have engendered for yourselves and the rest of the city to be, as it were, king bees and leaders in the hive. You have received a better and more complete education than the others, and you are more capable of sharing both ways of life. Down you must go then, each in his turn, to the habitation of the others, and accustom yourselves to the observation of the obscure things there. For once habituated, you will discern them infinitely better than the dwellers there, and you will know what each of the idols is, and therefore it is a semblance, because you have been the reality of the beautiful, the just, and the good. So our city will be governed by us and you with waking minds, and not, as most cities now, which are inhabited and ruled darkly as in a dream by men who fight one another for shadows and wrangle for office, as if that were a great good, when the truth is that the city in which those who are to rule are least eager to hold office must needs to best administered and most free from dissension, and the state that gets the contrary type of ruler will be the opposite of this.